Thanks for coming early. We're happy to. Our theme tonight is education, which is I think very timely with just schools starting up, trying to start up, and really happy to have Ruth Kravetz here today. Ruth is a retired teacher, and she's also a community organizer with the Houston Federation of Teachers, and she's going to talk about public education, schools reopening safely, and more. And as I said, she retired after 3 decades as a Houston ISD mathematics and chemistry teacher. Not my top subjects, but also a school administrator. She spent some time in Gambia, Bolivia, and Panama. She also co-founded Community Voices for Public Education with teachers, students, parents, and community members to support public schools as a cornerstone of democracy and to fight for equity and full funding. And with that, here is Ruth. Oh, she's muted.
Hey, everybody. So my name's Ruth. I was going to talk a little bit about public ed today, the safety issues, the equity issues, and then talk a little bit about how people can get involved. I think I want to start by talking about my connection to one of the people here. So I noticed that, I don't know what your first name is, Mr. Alter, but I know his daughter because I went to elementary and middle school with her, I think. And then I know his granddaughter because she went to high school with my daughter. And as a union member, his granddaughter became a first-year teacher at DeBakey last year. And I saw her on Facebook talking about the public ed safety issues. And we communicated via Facebook, and she became a union member because what we want to do in this weird time, this weird pandemic, is make sure that students and teachers are safe. So it's nice to see you, Mr. Alter, who is...
It's actually Mr. Cram.
This is Mr. Cram.
That's his last name, Crams, yeah.
Oh yeah, Robin Crams. That was her name when we were small. Thank you very much. So I appreciate everybody for letting me go down memory lane for a second. I moved here in the 70s, went to Brish Shalom. I'm going to start a slideshow, if we can find it.
Okay, what she asked, baby.
Okay, so I think there's like a couple, a little bit of time, and I wanted to first talk to you guys about what the Houston Federation of Teachers is, because Justin said some people might be interested. The Houston Federation of Teachers is the largest union in the state of Texas. This is a right-to-work state, unfortunately, so there's no collective bargaining rights, but it's a union that promotes social justice and good working conditions for teachers and support staff, and good learning conditions for students. So I've always felt that labor unions have a great place in ensuring that public schools, the cornerstone of our democracy, thrives. So I thought I'd start talking about the pandemic by talking a little bit about funding. Because when we talk about safety and equity issues, I don't think we can do anything without having a good funding stream. I've been teaching for 30 years. I remember in 2011 when our state cut the budget for public ed by $5 billion and only returned $1.5 billion the following year. So we've been existing with a funding shortfall for at least 10 years. And in 2006, they changed the property tax system. So schools were seriously underfunded then. So what we have right now is, before COVID, schools were underfunded. I think the school I taught at, Davis High School, had $500,000 less right now than it did 10 years ago. And then COVID happened, and people have estimated that COVID, to help schools safely recover, to handle the mental health needs of kids, to purchase all the broadband and Wi-Fi, to deal with the safety considerations, and the new plexiglass would require $250 billion. So far, the federal government has dished out $13 billion. So that's a big disparity between $250 and $13 billion. The HEROES Act was passed by the House in May for $58 billion to K-12. The Senate, it's held up in the Senate. There's a possibility of $100 billion, but that still will be $150 billion shortfall. So if there's anything I can ask you to do, the first thing would be to email our 2 senators and remind them that kids do matter and that the future of our society depends on them. Does anyone have any questions about funding? They do not. So I also wanted to talk about safety and opening equitably. I know that many of us are aware of what's going on in public ed right now, that Sci-Fair is set to reopen on Tuesday, and 40% of the students are going back face-to-face. Spring Branch is set to reopen with between 20 and 65% going back face-to-face. If things are anything like what happened in the University of Alabama, where kids were face-to-face the last 2 weeks and they now have 600 COVID cases, we're all in for a shock in our city, and we don't need another spike in COVID. We don't need teachers and students to die. Some people are saying going back is a good thing because it returns us to normalcy, but I picked this picture because this isn't a normal way for school to happen. If this was a classroom of third graders want to play games, and third graders want to hug their teachers, and if they come back to school where they have to stay 6 feet apart and they can't hug their teacher and they can't collaborate with kids, it's more like a prison than a school. So my wish has always been last May and in June and in July that our schools would focus on safely reopening by postponing the reopening and focusing on equity and making school as fun and as normal as possible for kids and for teachers, but that hasn't happened. We've been playing essentially reopening ping pong, as y'all have learned. The governor will say we're opening face-to-face, we're not opening face-to-face, we'll fund you, we won't fund you, and that's led to a lot of focus on how to handle funding gaps. So does anyone have any other questions? So I'll just continue. So a friend of mine, Dr. Donna Kim Murphy, she's a physician and also ran for Pearland ISD School Board. She was talking to me yesterday, and she said the challenge is that people are not using science for determining reopening protocols. They're using a timeline that says we have to do it by October. So for those of you who aren't familiar, the best way to think about it is Lena Hidalgo came up with 7 measures, but it's easy to put it to 3. One is having 14 consecutive days of downward COVID cases, 14 consecutive days of downward hospitalizations, to have a test positivity rate of less than 5%, and right now it's 15%, and to have a containment, which means 1 case per 100,000, which in the greater Houston area would be about 450 cases. And a week ago, we had 900 new cases per day in the greater Houston area. And I think today it was 760 cases. And we're just about to have Labor Day and probably have another spike. So there's lots of schools that are opening all over HISD. And this opening is delaying decisions about how to help students who are homeless, how to help students who were, like I taught at Northside, a mile north of downtown. My students went to Columbia and McAllister and Bowdoin and Harvard and Princeton, but they were in a very poor community, and you need small classes. You need to focus on helping people who are in need. That means people who are evicted, people who've been laid off and haven't had income for 3 to 6 months. You have to come up with a mechanism to help the families so that kids are not, as they were last spring, doing their homework under the McDonald's street lamp. So there's bunches of kids in the school where I taught where they don't have Wi-Fi, they don't have broadband, because as we said in this previous slide, the federal government has not allocated sufficient funds for schools to purchase Wi-Fi and computers. So there's kids sleeping, kids doing their homework in front of McDonald's, and kids whose parents are working and aren't going to be able to support them like some other parents can. So my sorrow is that our focus on opening and not opening and opening and not opening has led to a diminished interest in focusing on equity concerns to make things better. I wanted to talk about COVID in college because there's 2 situations. At the University of Arizona, they have a really cool system that I read about this weekend where they're testing people's poop. They're going, and the sewage system under the school, and dormitory by dormitory, every morning at 8:30, they're testing the feces of students, and when they find any amount of COVID, they then test every single student and swab them so that they're able to catch the evidence. And they found 2 or 3 kids who had COVID. They can find COVID about a week before it shows up in a swab test. And so their school doesn't have that much COVID incidents, whereas the University of Alabama, where my nephew is going, I think had 516 new cases in the first 2 weeks of school because they didn't have reasonable protocols. And unfortunately, in our schools, from what we're hearing, lots of people aren't wearing masks. We don't want to criminalize the wearing a mask. We don't want kids to get in trouble just because they're not wearing a mask. But it certainly is very unsafe to be in school right now. So in HISD, everything is virtual. They're minimizing the number of people who come to campus. They're trying to make virtual as much as possible. This is like a double job for teachers because trying to produce your lesson without actual contact with other human beings means that you have to work much more carefully on your lessons, and you're working twice as hard. So I think everybody wants to open face-to-face, but we need to recognize the long-term consequences. So I thought I would tell you some public education issues that I'd love for people to get involved in and some ways to get involved, and then I'll answer some questions if you have some. So the first is we need to reopen based on community transmission, not some arbitrary timeline. We've talked about that. The second is we need to suspend the STAR during the pandemic. The high-stakes standardized testing is used to fire teachers, needlessly shame children, and make them think that they're not as intelligent as they are, and close schools. And every neighborhood needs a grocery store, and every neighborhood needs a school. So STAR high-stakes testing has been used to diminish rich, meaningful instruction. And before the pandemic, I opposed high-stakes testing, as did 600,000 parents around the country when they opted out of standardized testing a couple of years back. And at this point, we should all be advocating for the governor to suspend it. It is an option that's available. You can individually as a school district or as a state request a waiver from STAR testing and the associated accountability. And it's the height of hubris for the governor or anyone to think that we should be focusing on STAR testing when so many people are out of work and so many people are getting evicted and kids haven't been in school for 4 to 5 months. And if your parents are doctors or lawyers, you can tutor them. But if your parents are like a friend of mine, her husband is a welding inspector, she's a stay-at-home mom, she lives in a multi-generational family, she has a 5-year-old who's dyslexic, a 3-year-old who's autistic, her husband was just laid off from work. She's a driven, committed, and awesome mom, and hopefully will be a city council member from the east side of town one day. But she doesn't have the experiences to help her own students in the ways others do. And it is, I think, the height of hubris to even think about STAR. The governor wants to give it to our kids. We need to actively oppose it. In Georgia, they have written a waiver to not give their high-stakes testing this year so they can focus on the well-being and betterment of kids. Another simple thing that we can do is to ask our governor and the Texas Education Agency to change the funding formula to enrollment-based. Right now, it's attendance-based. So a school like, say, Coulter with, and that's entirely tied to socioeconomic status. So attendance-based enrollment is not equitable, and it harms students in poor communities more. But with this pandemic, an attendance-based funding formula is going to even more disproportionately harm students who we want to support and get ready for a successful life. So if there's something, if you're bored and you want to write a letter, send a letter to the governor, send a letter to the school board and ask them to go to enrollment-based funding. I believe we need to have universal Wi-Fi in every neighborhood. In California, they have fiber optic cables all throughout the city. In Texas, they don't, so we're a little behind the curve, but we can, just like some public utilities are free to all or universally available, we need to look at Wi-Fi right now similarly. I wanted to talk briefly about disproportionate disciplining of students because as we think about ways to improve our schools, one is to make sure that we're not racially profiling our own students. So I always like to throw out the number that, and I taught mostly brown and black students. The percentage of students who are black, for example, in Houston ISD is 23%, but 50%, they constitute 50% of the out-of-school suspensions and almost 70% of the JJAP suspensions. So what that means is there's people across all strata, administrators, teachers, and so forth, who could stand to learn some restorative practices to address some of the biases that they bring to the table as humans. The last thing I think we should consider is a grace period of 60 days before evictions. I learned something when I talked to a city official. When we talk about evictions, we're not saying let somebody who can't pay the rent stay there forever, but we're saying someone who doesn't have a job because of COVID or other factors, that there's a grace period of 60 days, that the landlord and the tenant must talk to each other first to determine if the tenant can establish a payment plan, and they have to have these conversations and have a 60-day grace period before an eviction. They did it in Dallas, they did it in Austin, they have not done it in Houston. So those are some public ed ideas. Because of the time that I see we have left, I thought I'd ask if you guys would do something to get involved. This is my friend Alpa. We have a weekly Red for Ed, support teachers, protect educators, and support staff, where you can wear red when you go to the grocery store, or wear red in your house, or post red something on Facebook. And she posted a picture of herself and wrote, TEA doesn't have a plan to uniformly track COVID cases, but they're still tracking STAR. I thought that was interesting and ironic. And then after a couple people posted that, the state said they would in fact track STAR. So here's some light lifts, and I can send an email if you're interested. One is wear red. I have a forward-facing picture of the thing that's on my back. If you want to change your virtual image, I can share that link to Justin and he can send it out. There's this petition that doctors and teachers are creating that says, let's base reopening on community standards and focus on making virtual learning more equitable and fun and interesting and meaningful and rich. They have 120 doctors so far. We do need to focus on science. If you are interested, I'll put the link at the end. This would be a great petition to sign. It's a collaboration between doctors and teachers. The next link is to tell the governor to suspend the STAR test like they did in Georgia. And the last link is to request that the governor recognize that district by district, house by house, let me make sure I can turn this off. District by district, decisions about reopening are not wise or prudent. Certainly COVID doesn't stop at the Cy-Fair Independent School District County line. They should have made some statewide decisions in areas where there's no community transmission or little community transmission. Schools could reopen, and in areas like Houston where the community transmission is high, schools don't. But there weren't any statewide standards, and this fourth letter is to ask for standards. If you want to get even more involved, I belong to Community Voices, and we are matching, real low tech, matching students who live in poor communities with people who want to tutor English or math, 3rd grade, 4th grade, 5th grade, high school, whatever your interest is, they'll match you, and 1 hour a week, you get together with them on Zoom. There's a couple of requirements. You have to go and do the HISD background check, which is just an online check. And then you get matched. And it's a great way to make sure that one student or two students are more ready for their future, even with this pandemic. I'm asking that you talk to neighbors and friends and ask them to choose to stay virtual, because 65% of the parents in Stratford are saying go back face to face as if nothing has happened. And the last is to speak at a school board meeting and say some of the same things. So I appreciate talking to you, and if people have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Awesome question. What do I mean, so obviously students, families have the option of, in many districts, going back or virtual. Like, I mean, what did teachers, do they have options? Like if a teacher, you know what I mean? Like if a teacher was going back to a district like Cy-Fair, like you said, that's in person, are they required to go back, or how, you know, I was just curious how that might be working.
Well, let's start with the positive. A friend of mine teaches at Rice. So at Rice, the Rice professors have the option of choosing to go virtual or not. But high school teachers do not. So in Cy-Fair, the teachers were required to go to school for virtual professional development, and they are required to come to school. They don't get to choose virtual or not virtual, for the most part. And a friend of mine who's a special ed department chair and one of the most outstanding, supportive, loving people in this country, she had COVID a month ago. Somebody's gotten COVID again, so just having it doesn't mean you're not going to get it again. She has hypertension. She has fairly severe asthma, and she was told to report to work yesterday, even though teachers weren't supposed to report to work. So I think we need to protect our teachers and protect our students, which is why I have this background, because we're not working for a school district. HISD is doing a much better job than other school districts of trying to make sure that children and adults are safe. HISD has been in the news with bad press for so long that it's good to say something good about what they're doing. It's hard to run a large school district. So that's a good question. Teachers should have some options, although they can request an ADA form and do all virtual based on pre-existing conditions.
I've got a question. These kids that have already had at least 1 year of public school that are in low-income families without Wi-Fi, how have they been able to complete assignments outside the school without Wi-Fi? And why can't some of the funding that would normally be used for materials be used for Wi-Fi or internet access?
Well, that's a great question. I think it goes back to the amount of funding that schools have. They've been severely underfunded for many years. The estimates nationally for fully funding broadband and computers for all students for virtual instruction, plus the other services like children nutrition and mental health services due to the pandemic, estimates are $250 billion. And so far the federal government has spent $13 billion. So that's a very small percentage of what our school districts need. So they are replacing the monies that they would have spent on face-to-face instruction with purchasing computers and Wi-Fi, but those are so much more expensive. So last spring, many school districts didn't have the extra funds because it was unanticipated. So lots of kids were doing their homework in the neighborhoods in which I've worked, in front of McDonald's, at other people's houses, on their phones. And phone is not a device because it's hard to do homework and learn from your teacher on a little teeny phone. But I know that HISD purchased 40,000 computers. I think in Aldine, they don't have as much funding, so they're doing one Chromebook per family. So if you have a family of 5 kids, they're all sharing one computer. So I wish that we were focusing more on really robustly funding a handling of the digital divide. And the digital divide is not just having a computer and Wi-Fi, it's addressing a generation of not having a printer in your home because you're living hand to mouth. You have exactly enough money to make it till the end of to pay for food, and you don't have money to buy a printer or other things. I don't know if that's answering your question.
Okay, thank you.
Is anybody interested in volunteering, wanting to know more about that?
Well, I have a question. The children that speak Spanish at home and everywhere they go, and they've lost, the only time they ever use English is at school, and they've lost, I mean, they're in danger of really falling far behind the others.
True.
And there's been no provision for that. I mean, maybe during the summers, if they can't speak English well enough, they should check in every day with someone from the district just to talk English for a little while, or to write some English every day, or there's other things that could be done. But for them, despite the health risk,
It's a big challenge, you're right.
it might be better for them to be in school. And the University of Alabama, you've got kids that are partying, getting sick. I think with younger public school kids, the parents have a little bit more control over them.
So I don't have all the answers. I've talked to doctors and teachers. I do know that Clear Creek ISD opened yesterday and they already have a case of COVID. I don't
Which
know the
school?
answers. Clear Creek ISD
Oh,
opened yesterday. So this is just the beginning of school reopening. I don't have a crystal ball about what's going to happen, but Baylor, which isn't a super party school, is having some super incidences of COVID. Some places things are working, some they're not at all.
wait, Baylor, not a party school? We don't know what the students in the fraternities and sororities
You are
doing.
correct.
And
We
in
do
the
know-
dorms.
We
We
do
don't
know
know.
that, what did somebody tell me? They said to understand the COVID incidents in a school, think about glitter in an art class in 4th grade, and you give glitter to one kid and it's going to be on everybody. So I taught for 30 years. The classrooms are small. We come into contact
Yeah.
with lots and lots of kids. Somebody said to me, if kids are falling behind like the non-native English speakers, maybe they should go to school. But that just puts kids who are poor at the greatest risk. So I'll say what my friend Sarah Rivlin said. She's a ESL teacher, and she had kids last spring, and she set up a little program to provide $100 food vouchers to the students, because most were, I think of 18 kids in one class, of 20 kids in one class, 18 of them have parents who had lost their job in the first month after COVID. So there's that income, that the challenges that come with being newly very, very poor as opposed to being just working class. And on top of that are the challenges associated with losing your language acquisition. I'm a big proponent of a super influx of paid and volunteer tutors supporting our schools, kind of like a Marshall Plan for our schools, where each of us here on this call say, you know what, I could talk English to a 3rd grader or a 4th grader or a 5th grader who's a non-native English speaker, or whomever you're most interested in talking with. I know bunches of kids. I know bunches of adults. There's these 3 professors who say they want to do these matches. It's only going to start with 50 kids, but that's a start. I asked HISD to spend a lot more money on paying for a core of college students to be tutors to the kids you're talking about.
Well, back in the other pandemic in 1918, they used telephones to go to school. That was newfangled back then.
Oh yeah.
And maybe it was just the upper grade students, but they used telephones to do their schoolwork. And it lasted for 3 years.
So we need to come up with a mechanism to make a virtual learning as long as it lasts, as
Everybody's
equitable as
got a
possible.
cheap cell phone. Everybody. It's just a lack of imagination, I think.
Perhaps. I think the virtual, it's the online learning is similar. I don't have the answers. I know I've taught 20 to 35 kids in a classroom. Teaching virtually takes a finesse. Connecting is a different sort of thing. But you bring up good points. Do you want to volunteer?
I might.
Okay. I'll put my phone number in the chat.
I could even talk to someone on the telephone. Why do they? Okay, they don't have Wi-Fi. The libraries aren't open. The libraries are where poor people use the computer and printers a lot. They'll go in like twice a week, check their emails, correspond with their relatives.
Yeah, you would not need to go face to face or get on a computer. You could just talk to a kid on a phone.
No, yeah. If they don't have that, let's figure out a way to get to them easier. Everybody's got a cheap cell phone.
Bingo!
Cool.
All right. Well, Ruth, thanks for really appreciate you joining us today. And Ruth put her information is in the chat there, and again, really appreciate you coming out and informing us about HFD and how we can help, and kind of providing an update on what schools are doing right now. So
Cool. And just email me or call me, text me, and let me know if you're interested, and I'll give you a call and we'll see how you could be matched. Thank you a lot, Justin.
thanks, appreciate it.